Have you ever shared something vulnerable and then immediately regretted it? Like you knew you weren't really ready to be witnessed yet? Do you ever feel pressure to explain your growth just so people don't misread your behavior, your silence, your distance, or changes that you're making? Is there a part of you that believes your healing only counts if someone sees it, validates it, or celebrates it? When was the last time you made a huge shift in your life and told no one? What would happen if you stopped narrating your healing and simply lived it? So, hello again. It has been a minute if you've been wondering where I've been. The truth is, it wasn't a planned break. It wasn't a curated sabbatical or a month off that I pre-announced because it was unplanned. I've been living and healing in very unexpected ways recently. Through love and relationship, deeply repressed trauma surfaced recently, and I needed space and time to let that happen organically, to begin to heal a new layer, a new depth, a new chapter, and to get reacquainted with truths that I had long repressed. And I needed to do all of that without narrating it to my audience, without explaining myself. So this isn't a catch-up tell-all episode. This is a conversation about why you don't need to share everything about your healing in order to heal. So this episode is about how some of the most profound healing doesn't come from what's seen and what's posted or what's celebrated, but from what's sacred and quiet and off book, and how sometimes the most healing thing you can do is not explain yourself, not narrate the process, and not turn your inner transformation into external content. Because we live in a hyper-documented culture and society addicted to social media. Welcome to The Simple Source, a paradigm-shifting space where self-love, healing, spirituality, and personal growth are redefined. If you've been told healing takes years, that abundance must be attracted, or that transformation requires struggle, you haven't been told the truth. I'm Linda Valines, a certified trauma-informed holistic coach, author, and spiritual guide. After healing myself from chronic conditions, complex trauma, and lack, not by following traditional frameworks, but by creating my own, I'm now teaching you to love, heal, and free yourself, mind, body, and soul, so you can reclaim your highest health, happiness, and potential with joy and ease. Each week, we go beyond surface-level self-help and into the real mechanics of transformation. If the traditional paths to healing and spirituality haven't produced the changes you want in the life you desire, you're in the right place. You were never meant to struggle or wait for what is already yours. Let's get started with today's episode. Because we live in a hyper-documented culture and society addicted to social media. This is a digital era where transparency is the new norm, right? And people have been conditioned to turn their personal evolution into performance. Every meal, every mood, every win, every wound is shared, is explained, is posted. So we know who's meditating, who's not meditating, who's on vacation, where they're vacationing, right? Who's in a new relationship and with who's heartbroken, who's supporting what causes, who's doing the work. And while some of that openness has indeed created connection and has been inspiring, it's also quietly bred a compulsive need to be witnessed in order to feel valid. And, even I have felt a subtle pressure to explain my own growth in real time because everyone else seems to be narrating their healing for public consumption. So this is one of the reasons that I've actually grown tired of social media. It's just all the same to me at this point, right? It's the same quotes, the same trauma advice. Everyone's sharing nonstop. Everyone's posting all the time. And I'm just kind of over it. And it's just getting a little redundant and nothing really kind of feels precious anymore or sacred. Very, very rarely do I get genuinely inspired or lit up by social media content at this point. And that's just because it's a constant. It's It's just been a constant for a while. But I don't think that everything is meant to be processed aloud or in public, right? Not everything is content. So today I'm going to talk about how to maintain sacred self-respect and self-validation when you no longer need your healing to be seen, to be real. When you no longer feel obligated to overshare and over-explain or overexpose in order to prove to yourself or to someone else that you're doing the work. And so this episode is about that discernment, about knowing when to speak and when to keep your healing to yourself, because you don't need anyone else to see you healing to validate your healing in order to heal. So we're going to talk about when to share and when to self-contain and self-validate. Basically, when to allow your healing just to simply be yours. Because there's that myth that healing has to be seen in order to be valid. And the impact of that wounded belief is chronic self-exposure on the nervous system and the subconscious that actually prevents real healing. It doesn't help it. We're living in a time where transparency and external validation are the norm, right? Not just encouraged, but now expected. That's the pressure. That's what society is all about. Show me, tell me, share it, post it, like it. And, every single aspect of people's lives is on display, often in real time, right? We know what people are eating, who they're dating, how they're parenting, what they're healing from, what they're protesting about, what they're into or not into today, this week, right? It's all out there on some platform, some thread, being narrated, being captioned, being aestheticized. And again, some of that transparency is beautiful and it is revolutionary. And we are having conversations now that were once considered taboo. And so there are obviously positives. It's normalized healing, inner child work, shadow work, nervous system healing, and so much more. And yeah, for a lot of people, that transparency has felt like a lifeline, right? To witness someone else's journey and realize I'm not alone in this. But what began as collective permission to be real has, of course, become something else now, something performative, right? Noisier, less rooted, way the fuck less authentic, because we've moved from genuine vulnerability as connection to vulnerability as validation, right? From embodiment to explanation, from sovereignty to surveillance. And there's now like that quiet pressure to be visible in your process, to make your inner life digestible and content for other people, right? To turn your healing into a performance, essentially. And so what has happened with social media is that many people have internalized the idea that if no one sees you growing, it doesn't really count. That if you don't post about your transformation, it's not actually real or valid. That every chapter in life has to be shared, has to be captioned, has to come with a photo or a quote. Every breakthrough has to be made public. Every evolution or transformation you have to explain. And often that happens way before it's been fully processed and integrated. And that's not coherence, that's actually distortion, because your psyche changes when healing is constantly witnessed before it's actually truly integrated or processed adequately. Meaning when you expose a tender truth before it's settled in you, and when you narrate a transformation that you haven't yet fully embodied, it actually fragments and disrupts your process, your healing, because it tells your subconscious and your nervous system that being seen is more important than being safe. That performing coherence is more important than actually cultivating it. That your wholeness is only as valuable as its aesthetic, that your healing is not real and you are not you until other people approve of your healing and the version of you that you have, quote unquote, become. But here is the truth that needs to be said in this social media saturated society. You do not owe anyone your explanation of your healing, and you do not need to narrate your healing for you to heal and for your healing to be validated. You get to say, this is mine, and I don't have to share it with anyone. Because overexposure does have a cost. It does drain your energy. It does drain your clarity and your ability to regulate yourself. Because When your healing becomes externalized too soon, it can very much create confusion in your mind-body system. It can pull you literally out of the integration phase before you have fully integrated. And that's not just like a social habit. It becomes a nervous system habit. It's actually a trauma response marked as transparency and vulnerability, right? The desire to be seen becomes a replacement for the need to be safe, because that impulse to share becomes a way to manage your own uncertainty, your own insecurity. And that chronic narration and exposure of our lives becomes a strategy to soothe the parts of us that still fear being invisible, being unseen. Now, here's another truth. The most sacred healing actually happens off grid. It's not shared. It's not seen. It's beyond algorithms. It's outside of those threads. And we all need to learn to re-embrace the sacred in private instead of just blasting it in our stories every day. Because what I see too often is oversharing. That's not actually healing, but a trauma plea to be seen and validated. And that's why the oversharing trend is so disingenuous, because it's actually another form of a trauma response, and it doesn't actually serve productive healing. You know, there's a difference between sacred witnessing and compulsive oversharing. And too often now, healing is the latter, is subject to the latter. So let's talk about what witnessing is, because the desire to be seen is one of the most ancient and primal human needs. I actually did a whole episode about how to heal the wound of invisibility and not feeling seen. So if you haven't listened or watched that episode, you should go do that, because the need to be seen is present from infancy, right? Our nervous systems are wired for it. Because a baby cries, not just because it needs to get fed or has a need, you know, some sort of like physical survival need, but it also just needs to be felt. The baby needs to be mirrored. It needs to know, like, you see me, and so I exist. So healthy witnessing is essential in the early stages of development and throughout our lives. It's how we learned who we are in relationship to the world. It's how our nervous systems learned to co-regulate. It's how we internalize safety and attunement and emotional resonance. So yeah, we need to be seen, but we need to be seen by regulated, attuned caregivers, people who aren't projecting their own stories onto us. So that's important to understand, because for so many people, especially people healing from attachment wounds like neglect, childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences, there's a rupture in that early experience of being witnessed. And so the nervous system stores the unmet need to be seen. And that unmet need then later shows up as an adult obsession with visibility. And it doesn't just show up in relationships, it shows up in how we use social media, how we communicate, how we share our healing. And so when that need to be seen hasn't been metabolized in a safe, attuned way, it doesn't matter how many followers you have or how many people, quote unquote, like your vulnerability or how many comments like have validated your post. It's actually never going to be enough, because you're still going to feel the wound, that emptiness, because your nervous system is seeking a form of witnessing that social media cannot provide. So when we're sharing something personal or vulnerable online, even if we're doing it with someone in person, we're actually opening a gateway, right? So if that response that we receive doesn't match what our body needs to feel safe, we can become dysregulated. And so that means if you're still in a fragile, unintegrated place in your healing, and then you post something like deeply personal, hoping for some sort of external validation or affirmation, and then what you receive is like judgment or someone misunderstanding you, or even like no response, like just silence, then your body might actually interpret that as a threat, right? Not consciously, but somatically. And the result is that you're going to feel exposed, maybe even anxious or confused or even ashamed. And you might not even understand why you feel that way. Because on the surface, it seems like you were just sharing, right? You were being brave, you were being vulnerable. But on a deeper level, your subconscious was really trying to repair a need to be seen that the internet and social media simply cannot meet. So here's another layer to that, okay? Witnessing without containment can actually fragment and distort the healing process, because when we externalize an internal transformation before it's embodied, it inhibits integration. Right. So there's that one part of you that's living the transformation, right? Changing, while the other part of you is just like curating and narrating it, meaning you're putting energy into performing it in a way, managing how it's being received, instead of actually integrating what's changing. And then that puts your nervous system in a state of performative hypervigilance, where you're not fully in the experience of transformation. You're watching yourself, curating yourself, having the experience. And that's actually called self-objectification, and it does have a real cost. So studies in neuropsychology have shown that when we're chronically self-observing, meaning we're monitoring how others are perceiving us, it reduces our capacity for presence and integration. And so in trauma terms, it creates like a freeze-fawn loop where you suppress authentic expression. That's the freezing, while you end up performing vulnerability because you hope that you're accepted that way. And that's fawning. And so that keeps you trapped in a false identity loop where what you think is digestible to others is what you perform, and you're not actually being your true authentic self. And so that means that not all witnessing is actually healing. So there's a massive difference between sacred witnessing and compulsive overexposure, between sharing from an integrated place and narrating to soothe unprocessed pain and unresolved trauma of not being seen. Trauma is stored primarily somatically, meaning in the body, in the nervous system, right? Not just in the mind. So healing trauma requires conditions of felt, not just cognitive safety. I say this a lot in this podcast. And that cannot be manufactured by likes, by people commenting, or by external validation. It happens when your body is not in a state of hypervigilance. It happens when there is zero pressure to perform. And privacy, while you're integrating, creates that condition, because integration is a physiological process, right? The brain needs time and space to form new neural pathways. And that's especially true when you're rewiring old survival patterns and shifting subconscious beliefs, or when you're processing trauma. Because every time you speak something aloud, especially something vulnerable or something that you're working through, you actually anchor it neurologically as part of your narrative. And that's called memory consolidation. So that means that if you speak something painful about your narrative too early, meaning before your nervous system has fully reprocessed, fully recontextualized it, you do risk reinforcing the trauma loop rather than resolving it. But when you let your experience breathe, when you allow it to live in your body, unspoken, unnarrated, unperformed, unshared, your system then has the space, the time, the space, the energy to then choose a new meaning, meaning a deeper truth, one that isn't filtered through performance or external perception, but just through your presence. And that is actually what creates coherence. When you honor privacy, like real privacy, not avoidance, okay, there's a difference. You give your nervous system something that it rarely gets in today's culture, which is a break from hypervigilance, from performing, from reactivity, from comparison, from that digital mirror called social media. And privacy also allows your parasympathetic nervous system, right, your rest and repair part of your nervous system to activate. That's what your self-healing mind body need, is your parasympathetic nervous system activated. That's when cellular healing happens. That's when your immune function gets turned on and strengthens. That's when emotional regulation improves, right? That's when your brain actually thinks like cognitively, sharply, acutely. That's when you become more creative. You move out of survival, and then because you've become regulated. Now, that's not just like a metaphor. That's like what is really happening physiologically when you're in primarily a parasympathetic state. It's just your biology. So you can't heal if your system is constantly being stimulated, being dysregulated, right, by being watched or evaluated, even subconsciously. Every time you prepare to share, whether it's a vulnerable post or a story that you think like people need to hear about your healing, your body actually activates. Like there's a cascade of responses that happens, right? Your breath starts to change, your heart rate starts to speed up, and your mental acuity shifts, okay? You enter into a state of performance, whether you're aware of it or not. But when you go inward, when you move into intentional sacred privacy, you're not actually abandoning connection. You're choosing connection with yourself over external validation. That means you're reclaiming your own energy, your own field, your own truth, your own knowing. And that reclamation is actually quite revolutionary in this digital age and very healing in a world that constantly distracts us, constantly pulls us away from ourselves. So silence is sacred. Privacy can be powerful, and what's unspoken can still be deeply alive and very healing. So if you have been craving silence, but you're afraid of being misunderstood or afraid of being seen as distant, if you've been feeling the pull to go inward, but maybe you're worried about what that might look like to other people, like you're worried that it could look like you're hiding or something, let this be your permission slip to go dark, friend, to go quiet, to go off book, not to disappear, but really to do you so that you can reappear more rooted. So now let's talk about when to share and why to share and what the criteria is for conscious sharing. You really should be asking yourself 4 main questions, okay? 1, is this integrated? 2, am I regulated? 3, am I resourced? And 4, am I sharing from coherence or from a need to be seen? Because again, not all sharing is the same, right? Sharing from a regulated, integrated place is how you want to share because it means you're sharing from authentic empowerment. However, sharing from a fragmented, performative place is an energy leak because it's an inauthentic ploy, really, to repair unresolved trauma. And so if you don't know the difference, you end up risking turning your sacred healing and your inner work into a public broadcast that you are likely going to feel icky about. And really the most important question to ask is number 4, really. Am I sharing from coherence or from a need to be seen? Let's unpack what that actually means so that you can answer that confidently. I talk about coherence on this podcast a lot because it's so central for authentic healing and vitality and spirituality and living in alignment. Because what coherence is when you're mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually in alignment. It's when what you say matches what you believe, what you embody, and what your nervous system state is and can handle. So when you're sharing from coherence, that means the part of you that's speaking is resourced, is anchored, is rooted, and ready to be witnessed. Exposure, or like when you're sharing because you want to be seen, that often happens from a dysregulated state, right? Because it feels urgent. Maybe you feel anxious, you feel fragile, or even like you feel like a compulsion to get it out. And that is not the same thing as authentic expression. It's a form of nervous system discharge. Like it can feel like relieving in the moment, but again, it often leaves you feeling more scattered, more vulnerable, more anxious, or confused afterward. Here's something that you should think about. Like just because something feels cathartic doesn't actually mean that it's integrated, okay? And just because something is real doesn't mean it's actually ready to be shared and witnessed. Now, in trauma recovery, timing is everything because the primary question to ask when healing trauma is the memory, is the insight safe to explore now? And do I have the internal capacity to stay grounded and regulated while processing and healing it? Because when you activate a story or a wound, really, without being internally resourced, without being internally supported, meaning you have the capacity to hold it, you do risk re-traumatization. And that's the same thing for all healing, right? And for sharing. Because if you share before your nervous system has fully digested the experience, you're essentially taking a half-baked transformation and you're making it vulnerable to distortion and projection and judgment and criticism. And all of that can hinder your integration and your ability to heal productively and joyfully. And that's why trauma specialists really emphasize resourcing first and healing second. So in terms of sharing and exposure, that just means you have to ground yourself in safety before you share, not after you share. Because when you share from a grounded state, your story then becomes medicine. But when you share from an activated and wounded state, your story then just becomes a reenactment. Now, how do you know if you're ready to share something? Okay, so let's go through a few somatic checkpoints just to help you determine if you're sharing from a resourced and ready place or not. So the first thing to check is your breath regulated, right? If you're breathing shallowly, if you're holding your breath, meaning you're feeling urgent, if there's urgency in your chest, urgency in your throat, you're in a stress response, right? It's not the time to open your inner world to others. It's time to regulate. It's time to integrate. And so another thing is are you looking for validation or are you looking for connection, right? Needing to be validated isn't wrong. It's very human to want to be validated. But if your sharing hinges on needing to be affirmed, then you probably need to self-validate first before you externally share. Because true connection doesn't require applause or agreement or likes. And another question is are you able to hold the response, meaning any response, with neutrality? That means if someone misreads what you share, meaning they don't understand what you intended to express, or if they judge it, or if you get no response at all, would you be cool? Would you be chill? Or would you spiral? Meaning, can you stay anchored in your own truth, regardless of how it's received? If you can, then yes, you're ready to share. If not, you're not ready to share. It's time to integrate, and you need time for yourself. And also, if you've integrated the experience, then you're most likely ready to share. But if you're still inside the integration process, meaning if you're still in an emotional storm, if you're still feeling overwhelmed, then sharing might just create more chaos than clarity for you. You probably want to wait until you've metabolized what you're healing in order to speak from a healed place, instead of your wounded self. And all of that actually requires you to self-validate first. So let's talk about self-validation. So people who lack internal self-validation will often seek it externally, especially during vulnerable moments. And so what that is just a coping mechanism. It's definitely not a sustainable one, because the more that we outsource our self-worth, essentially is what we're doing when we're looking for external validation, the more dependent we become on unhealthy forms of external validation. So when you've done the inner work to validate yourself, your own healing, you actually don't need other people to reflect it back to you for it to feel real. And that's when sharing becomes a choice, a conscious choice, not a compulsion, because you don't owe anyone access to your healing and to your inner world. And this is when boundaries come in, okay? Because boundaries are not optional. They are so essential to protect your healing, your sacred space. And in that sacred space, you get to have private breakthroughs. You get to hold sacred grief without telling anyone. You get to celebrate quiet victories that no one claps for except for your inner child, maybe, right? And that doesn't make any part of your healing any less real. In fact, it often makes it more real because you're anchoring it into your own system first. You're not outsourcing it to be mirrored and then applauded. So really what I'm saying is like you get to heal with sovereignty. And society tells us that our value is in our visibility, but that's when choosing sovereignty and privacy is a radical healing act, because then that's when you can reclaim the power of being with yourself, right? Without an audience, without a script, and without your nervous system chronically being activated from performance-based healing. And so we all need to rewrite that social contract around healing. Like it's not your job to make your healing journey palatable. It's not your job to narrate your every transformation and breakthrough. And it's definitely not your job to turn your nervous system state into content. You're allowed to evolve in peace and quiet. You're allowed to change your mind without explaining yourself. You're allowed to shift timelines without documenting every single step of it. Because the truth is, the most powerful transformations often happen when no one is watching, when you're not performing your growth, but you're just simply living it, embodying it, when you're not telling the story, but you are just stretching into your own healing joyfully. And that truth doesn't just sound nice. It's actually very physiologically rooted, because neuroscience shows that mirror neurons, right, the brain's system for empathy, for imitation, can become overstimulated by constant exposure to other people's emotional states. And that's what leads to compassion fatigue and comparison loops and emotional enmeshment. Like it's one reason we all feel drained or dysregulated after scrolling social media for a while. But when you reclaim privacy, you're not just protecting your energy, you're actually interrupting those dysregulated loops. Like you're giving your brain and your body space to return to yourself, to your own experience, to your own truth, to your own private existence and healing. Because you belong to you. Your story is yours to tell or yours to keep private, right? Your healing is yours to share or yours to guard. Like your timeline is yours to live and follow or yours to deviate and change. Like it's all you. It's all for you. And your healing is not a show. It's not a race. Your reclamation of your freedom, your well-being, your wholeness is not a performance. It can't be a performance. It's sacred and it must be respected and self-validated first, because when you stop trying to be understood, then you can start to understand yourself. When you stop trying to be witnessed, that's when you can witness yourself. And that is when real healing begins. So here's your action step for the week. I want you to choose one area of your life or your healing journey where you felt the urge to share or explain or narrate. And then I want you to choose sovereignty and self-validation instead. That means spending a few hours or an entire day just practicing sacred self-containment. That means don't post about it, don't write about it online, don't text anyone about it, don't digest it for show. Just be with it. Be with it in your body, right? Let it root in you without needing it to be externally witnessed. And then in that practicing of sacred containment, I want you to ask yourself, what do I feel when I am not sharing this, but embodying this and integrating this? And what part of me wants to be seen? And how can I witness that part of myself for myself with unconditional love, clarity, and peace? And then that is when the real integration of your healing begins too. And when you answer those questions honestly and you allow those answers to reveal what kind of relationship you have with your healing, that's when you can understand, like, is your healing sacred and honored with integrity? Or is it something that's become part of the mass market? In this world of public personas and oversharing and over-explaining, not everything sacred needs to be shared and explained publicly. We all need to remember that, because sometimes the deepest healing is the healing that you hold close and quietly, that you protect. and that you let transform you without you telling the world about it. And so I hope that you practice discernment in your healing, because not everyone needs to know that you're healing or every detail about your healing, because we heal for ourselves. That's the truth. We don't heal for anyone else. And privacy isn't just protection from a public obsessed world. It's actually protection of your energy and your peace and your power. And all of this is something that I've been telling myself recently in the past month, and because I'm still integrating everything that I'm living through. And I was like, yeah, I could do, a whole podcast episode about what I've been living through. But then I was like, why? Why do I feel that need to share every part of my healing journey when this part of my healing is actually really sacred, really precious, and I want to honor it that way? And so this is your permission to do the same. And in doing that, by respecting your healing, by keeping it safe for yourself, you actually love yourself more. And then you do heal yourself more. Thank you so much for being here today. I hope this episode awakened you, inspired you, and reminded you of what's possible when you love, heal, and free yourself and reclaim your highest truth and power. If this show has transformed or enlightened your self-love, growth, and healing journey, please like, save, and share this episode, and leave a positive review on Apple or Spotify. And subscribe to be reminded of new episodes. Your support is deeply appreciated and truly helps this show so much. And if today's episode resonated with you, don't stop here. Go deeper. My book, Unconditional, You Are Perfect As You Are, expands on these teachings and gives you the missing framework about self-love that no one is talking about. So get your copy today to start reading and loving yourself more. And if you're ready for the ultimate healing journey with daily instruction and guidance from me, I'd love to see you inside the Source membership, the only holistic and comprehensive step-by-step self-healing program that is proven to work. Remember, you were never meant to struggle or wait for what is already yours. It's time to claim everything you want and more. All the links are in the show notes. I'll see you next time.